I told my own daughter that I could not watch the grandchildren that Sunday. I explained with my voice shaking and my chest tight with sorrow that I had to attend my brother's funeral. The man who saved my life was being put into the cold ground, and I needed to be there to say my final goodbye. I thought she would understand. I thought there would be a shred of human empathy in her eyes. Instead, my daughter Natalie crossed her arms, looked at me with a coldness that froze my blood, and said, "You still have to do it, Dad. There is no other choice. We are dropping them off." I stood there in my own kitchen, stunned completely, unable to believe what I had just heard. If you are just tuning in to this story, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a story of betrayal, so calculated and so cruel it forced me to tear down my own family. Before I continue, please let me know in the comments which city you are watching from today. And hit that like button if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who tried to use you. The air in the kitchen grew heavy and suffocating. I looked at Natalie, trying to find the little girl I had raised, but all I saw was a selfish stranger. My brother Bill was not just a sibling to me. He was the only reason I was still breathing. My mind instantly flashed back to a freezing November morning in 1985. We were working on a massive high-rise construction site in downtown Chicago. I was a structural engineer, but that morning I was down in the dirt inspecting a deep trench for the foundation. Above me, a rusted steel cable snapped. A massive 2-ton steel beam fell from the crane directly toward me. I did not even hear it fall, but Bill did. Without a single second of hesitation, my brother sprinted across the uneven concrete, tackled me out of the trench, and took the crushing weight of that falling steel himself. The terrible impact shattered both of his legs instantly. He went through 12 grueling surgeries and spent the rest of his life walking with a heavy limp, relying on a thick wooden cane. He sacrificed his own body so that I could live. He suffered every single day in silence, never once complaining, just so I could go home safely and hold my little girl. And now, decades later, that very same little girl was standing right in front of me, coldly denying me the right to bury the honorable man who gave her a father. I asked her how she could possibly be so heartless. I asked her how she could demand this of me on the darkest weekend of my entire life. That was when Derek, her husband, stepped forward. Derek was a commercial real estate broker. He always wore these flashy, expensive custom suits that cost more than my first car, and he always treated me like I was just a foolish, outdated old man. He looked at me with that fake, condescending smile he always used and sighed loudly. He said, "Harrison, please do not make this about you. My firm is facing a catastrophic financial crisis. We have a life-or-death corporate merger scheduled in New York this weekend. If we do not fly out there and close this deal, the company goes under forever. We lose absolutely everything." Natalie quickly chimed in, her voice dripping with absolute venom and emotional manipulation. She stepped closer to me, aggressively pointing her finger at my chest. She asked me if I wanted my grandchildren to end up living on the street. She accused me of being horribly selfish. She said, "Dad, are you really going to choose a dead man over your living, breathing grandchildren? Do you want us to go bankrupt and lose our beautiful home? Bill is already gone. He does not know if you are at the funeral or not. But Leo and Mia need you right now." The guilt trip was incredibly heavy and perfectly calculated. They were gaslighting me, twisting my deep grief into sudden guilt. They knew exactly what my weakness was. They knew I would gladly walk through a burning building for my grandchildren. Leo was 8 years old, a quiet and highly observant boy, and little Mia was 6, full of joyful life and complete innocence. I looked past Derek and Natalie, gazing into the living room, where the 2 kids were sitting on the rug, playing quietly with their wooden toy blocks. They were completely unaware of the toxic poison spewing from their parents' mouths. My heart physically ached. I felt entirely trapped in a corner. I swallowed my heavy grief, clenched my rough, calloused hands into tight fists, and slowly nodded my head. I told them I would take the kids. I told them to go to New York and save their company. They did not even offer a single word of comfort. They did not say thank you or offer their condolences. Derek just checked his expensive gold watch, grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, and immediately turned toward the door. Natalie walked over to the living room, gave Leo and Mia a very quick empty hug, and told them to behave for Grandpa. Then they walked out the front door, practically jogging down my driveway without looking back. They climbed into Derek's brand new luxury car and started the powerful engine. I slowly walked out onto the front porch, holding my grandson Leo securely by his small hand. I stood there in complete silence, watching the sleek car reverse out of the driveway and speed away down the quiet suburban street. I felt a deep, hollow ache settling in my chest. I was mourning the tragic loss of my beloved brother, and at the exact same time I was mourning the daughter I mistakenly thought I had raised. I felt utterly defeated, completely crushed under the overwhelming weight of my own family's selfish demands. But then the quiet morning air was suddenly broken. Little Leo gently tugged on the sleeve of my faded flannel shirt. I looked down at him. He was staring intently down the empty street where his parents' car had just vanished into the distance. He looked up at me with his big, innocent eyes, his small brow wrinkled in genuine childhood confusion. He asked me a simple question that made the blood in my veins run absolutely cold. He said, "Grandpa, if Mommy and Daddy are going to a boring office in New York, why did they pack snowboards and ski goggles in the trunk?" I froze. The innocent question from my 8-year-old grandson hung in the crisp morning air, heavy and sharp as a shattered pane of glass. Snowboards. Ski goggles. I looked down at Leo, his big eyes blinking up at me, waiting for an answer that I suddenly did not have. My heart started to pound aggressively against my ribs. A cold, sinking feeling, the kind of absolute certainty that only comes from a lifetime of trusting your gut, washed over my entire body. I forced a gentle smile for the young boy, telling him that sometimes adults pack silly things for stressful trips just to feel a little bit better. It was a terribly weak excuse, but it satisfied him enough to make him run back inside to play with his little sister. I stayed on the wooden porch for a long moment. The silence of the neighborhood felt heavy and oppressive. I needed to know the absolute truth. I walked back into the house and made sure the kids were happily occupied with their wooden blocks in the living room. I quietly slipped into the kitchen and picked up Leo's digital tablet from the granite counter. My daughter had set up a family tracking application on it a few years ago to keep tabs on everyone. She always boasted to her friends about how it kept our family safe and connected. I opened the application with trembling fingers. A digital map loaded on the bright screen displaying small icons for each of our devices. I zoomed in on the icon representing Derek's phone. If they were truly flying to New York for a desperate life or death corporate merger, they would be heading straight for the bustling terminals of the main international airport. But the small blue dot on the screen was not moving anywhere near there. It was traveling in the exact opposite direction. I watched the digital dot glide smoothly along the highway, turning off the main road and heading directly toward an exclusive private airfield on the wealthy outskirts of the city. I clicked on the destination details that the application helpfully predicted based on their travel history and calendar reservations. The screen cheerfully informed me that they were booked on a private charter flight. The destination was a luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado. I stared at the bright screen until my eyes burned. The digital blue dot pulsed rhythmically, mocking my profound grief. Aspen. They were going to Aspen. A suffocating wave of nausea rolled through my stomach, twisting my insides into tight, painful knots. They had not just lied to me. They had looked me right in the eyes, invoked the sacred memory of my recently deceased brother, and shamelessly guilt-tripped me all so they could go drink expensive champagne on a snowy mountain. They skipped the funeral of the brave man who saved my life for a luxury vacation. The sheer cruelty of it took the breath right out of my lungs. They used my intense grief against me. They used my deep love for my grandchildren as a convenient free babysitting service. I felt a burning anger ignite deep within my chest, a quiet, dangerous kind of rage that I had not felt in decades. It was the kind of anger that makes your hands completely steady and your mind perfectly sharp. I spent the rest of the day in a numb daze playing the role of the loving grandfather. I cooked their favorite macaroni and cheese for lunch, built tall towers out of wooden blocks, and read them adventure stories until their little eyes grew heavy. Once the sun finally set and the house was completely silent, I knew exactly what I had to do. The boundaries of trust were officially shattered. I had to break the rules. I walked slowly down the long hallway and stood before the heavy oak door of Derek's home office. He always kept it strictly off limits to everyone. I turned the cold brass knob. It was unlocked. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, turning on the small, elegant desk lamp. The room was a monument to superficial wealth and fragile male ego. Everything in the office was designed to project an image of extreme, unearned success. There were imported leather sofas, a massive mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine, and expensive abstract paintings that meant absolutely nothing. I stood there looking at my own hands in the dim, warm light. My hands were rough, permanently scarred, and deeply calloused from 40 grueling years of welding heavy steel and drafting architectural blueprints. I built real things. I built massive structures that could withstand furious hurricanes and terrible earthquakes. I worked until my back ached and my fingers bled to provide a solid, unwavering foundation for my daughter. And she had chosen a man who built absolutely nothing, a man who traded invisible money and lived entirely on fake appearances. I felt a profound sense of failure as a father. I had somehow raised a daughter who valued this empty, flashy room more than she valued basic human decency. I began to search the room. I did not care about privacy anymore. I sat down in his luxurious leather chair and examined the massive mahogany desk. On the bottom right side there was a heavy steel drawer. I pulled the handle, but it was locked tight. A small keyhole sat flush against the dark wood. But I am an engineer. I spent decades on rough construction sites, learning how things are put together, which means I also know how to take them apart. I retrieved a metal tension wrench and flathead pick from my toolbox. I knelt beside the desk, slid the tools into the keyhole, and applied gentle pressure. I heard a sharp click. The lock gave way. I pulled the drawer open. Inside was a thick folder. Printed across the front tab was my full name followed by my home address. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached into the dark metal drawer and pulled out the heavy manila folder. The thick paper felt cold and rigid against my calloused fingertips. My full legal name, Harrison Cole, was typed clearly across the top label in bold black ink, directly above the address of the home I had lived in for over 40 years. I sat back in Derek's excessively plush black leather chair and carefully rested the folder on the polished mahogany desk. The quiet, steady hum of the central air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roaring wind. I slowly opened the cover. The first document I saw was a comprehensive property appraisal report. It was printed on thick, expensive paper, complete with high-resolution color photographs of my own front yard. I stared at the glossy image of my home. It was a beautiful 1920s craftsman-style house situated on a quiet, tree-lined street in the historic heart of Chicago. I did not just buy that house. I poured my literal blood, sweat, and tears into it. When my late wife and I first purchased the property, it was nothing more than a decaying, forgotten shell. Over 3 decades, I personally restored every single inch of it. I rebuilt the crumbling stone foundation with my own 2 hands, mixing the heavy concrete. I climbed the steep roof in the sweltering heat of summer to lay every single cedar shingle by hand. I spent countless late nights in my garage carefully sanding the original oak floorboards until they gleamed. That house was not just a piece of real estate. It was a living monument to my beautiful marriage and the safe haven I had built for my family. To see it reduced to a stack of clinical appraisal photographs sitting in my deceitful son-in-law's locked drawer made my stomach turn. I turned the pages of the report, scanning the dense blocks of financial text. The appraiser had meticulously documented the custom woodwork and the reinforced steel beams I had installed to open up the living room. They had assigned a market value of $1.8 million to my life's work. A terrifying question echoed in my mind. Why would Derek, a commercial real estate broker who dealt exclusively in high-rise office buildings, commission a residential appraisal on my private home, without telling me I had completely paid off the mortgage 15 years ago, shortly after my beloved wife passed away? I did that specifically to ensure that I would never owe a single dime to any bank for the rest of my life. I wanted to leave a completely unburdened, debt-free legacy for my daughter to inherit. I flipped past the final page of the appraisal report, desperately hoping to find a logical explanation, but what I found instead made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Attached behind the photographs was a thick stack of legal banking documents printed on official watermarked paper from a major national bank. The bold capitalized letters across the top of the first page read, "Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement." My breathing became shallow. A home equity line of credit is a tool that allows a homeowner to borrow money by using the equity of their house as collateral. It is essentially a mortgage. I pulled a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses from my shirt pocket, my rough hands shaking violently. I slid them onto my face and forced my aging eyes to focus on the fine print. The document outlined a massive financial transaction. Someone had successfully applied for and secured a massive loan against the completely paid-off value of my historic craftsman house. I scanned down to the middle of the page where the principal loan amount was printed in bold, undeniable ink. $600,000. The numbers blurred together as a wave of intense vertigo washed over me. $600,000. It was an astronomical sum of money. If this loan went into default, the bank had the absolute legal right to foreclose on my property. They could seize the house I had rebuilt with my own bare hands, legally evict me, and auction it off to the highest bidder. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my chest. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. This had to be a mistake. A bank cannot simply hand over more than $500,000 and place a massive lien on a property without the explicit legally binding authorization of the property owner. I had never spoken to a loan officer. I had never stepped foot inside that specific bank branch in my life. I had certainly never agreed to put my sanctuary at risk to fund whatever luxury vacations Derek and Natalie were hiding. I gripped the edges of the paper, my knuckles turning white under the strain. I rapidly flipped through the dense pages of legal jargon, ignoring the complex interest rate clauses and strict repayment schedules. I was driving straight toward the very last page of the contract, the only page that truly mattered. The primary signature page. I stared down at the bottom right corner of the document, where the primary borrower was legally required to sign their name in ink. My breath completely caught in my throat. There, resting perfectly on the solid black line, was my name. Harrison Cole. I leaned in closer, my eyes wide with horror and disbelief. It was a flawless, perfect forgery of my own handwriting. The distinct sweeping loops of my cursive and the deliberate angles of my signature had been copied with terrifying precision. I ran my thumb over the ink, feeling the indentation where the pen had pressed into the paper. And right beside that perfectly forged signature, making the fraudulent loan document absolutely official and legally binding, was the dark blue raised ink seal of an official state-registered notary public. I stared at the signature on the final page of the loan agreement, my mind completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the crime sitting right in front of me. It was not just a clumsy attempt at copying my name. It was a calculated, legally binding authorization sealed with the official stamp of a notary public. I ran my trembling fingers over the blue ink, feeling a profound sickness spreading through my chest. How could a major national bank approve a $600,000 loan without ever speaking to me directly? How could a professional notary legally witness a signature that I never provided in their presence? The terrifying questions swirled in my head like a violent storm. I leaned back in the plush leather chair, rubbing my aching temples as the cold reality began to set in. I closed my tired eyes, and suddenly a deeply buried memory pierced through my confusion. The answer was not a simple forgery in the traditional sense. The answer was a dangerous weapon that I had willingly handed to my own daughter. 5 years ago, I experienced a sudden health scare. I was working alone in my detached garage, carefully sanding down a beautiful piece of reclaimed oak wood for a new dining table, when my chest suddenly tightened with a sharp pain, and the entire world spun completely out of focus. It turned out to be a minor issue with my blood pressure. Nothing that a strict change in my daily diet and some basic prescription medication could not easily fix. But out of an abundance of caution, my doctors required me to spend 2 days in the local hospital for observation. The sterile hospital room was terribly cold and lonely, constantly reminding me of the tragic night I lost my dear wife. Natalie had rushed to my hospital bedside the moment she heard the news. Looking back now, I realize she put on a masterful performance of the terrified, devoted daughter. She sat by my sterile hospital bed for hours, her eyes painted red and puffy from crying, tightly holding my rough, calloused hand in both of her soft ones. She told me repeatedly how terrified she was of losing her only parent. She begged me to be responsible and highly practical about the uncertain future. With heavy tears streaming down her face, she presented me with a thick, professionally bound legal document. She called it a standard medical and financial power of attorney. She swore to me on my late wife's grave that it was only a necessary precaution, a simple, harmless safety net, just in case I was ever severely incapacitated and could not make vital life decisions for myself. I was physically exhausted, heavily medicated, and overwhelmed by an aging father's unconditional love for his deeply worried child. I trusted her implicitly with my life. I signed the legal document without a single second thought, willingly granting her the absolute legal authority to act on my behalf in any financial or medical capacity. I opened my eyes in Derek's silent, dimly lit office, the bitter memory making me physically sick to my stomach. That signed document was never meant to be a loving safety net. It was a blank check. It was a loaded gun that she had kept carefully hidden in her back pocket for half a decade, just patiently waiting for the perfect, tragic moment to pull the trigger. She used that comprehensive power of attorney to legally bypass my direct consent entirely. With that single piece of notarized paper, she could easily walk into any commercial bank site confidently across from any senior loan officer and legally sign my name to a massive financial burden without ever needing my physical presence or my verbal permission. The official notary stamp resting on the fraudulent loan agreement was not verifying that I was sitting in the room. It was officially verifying that my legally appointed representative, my own flesh and blood, was lawfully authorizing the catastrophic destruction of my entire life savings. She had ruthlessly weaponized my own mortality and my profound love for her against me. The deep sense of absolute betrayal was entirely suffocating. I desperately needed to see the full extent of the financial damage with my own 2 eyes. I needed to know exactly how deep this toxic wound truly went. I reached into the pocket of my faded jeans and pulled out my smartphone. I am a simple man of very predictable, old-fashioned habits. I live quite comfortably on my hard-earned pension and the modest savings I slowly accumulated over a long lifetime of grueling manual labor. Because of this, I rarely ever check my online banking portal. My monthly expenses are incredibly low. I do not buy flashy things, and I certainly do not ever gamble with my hard-earned financial security. My calloused hands were shaking so violently in the quiet room that it took me 3 frustrating attempts to type in my secure digital password. The small digital screen illuminated my tired, lined face as the banking application slowly loaded. I navigated to the primary dashboard, bracing my fragile heart for whatever horrific financial reality awaited me. My standard checking account balance appeared at the top of the bright screen. It looked completely normal and untouched. But then directly below it, a brand new account line had been freshly created under my name. It was clearly labeled as a home equity line of credit. The available balance remaining on the massive loan was $0. My heart skipped a painful beat. A $600,000 loan had been fully approved and completely exhausted. I quickly tapped on the recent transaction history for that specific account. The stolen money had not stayed in my possession for even a single minute. Exactly 3 days ago, the massive sum was initiated as an outgoing wire transfer. It was sent to a mysterious corporate entity called Apex Holdings LLC. I stared at those 3 words glowing on my digital screen. Apex Holdings LLC. The name meant nothing to me, but the terrifying reality settled heavily in my tired bones. $600,000 of my hard-earned legacy had vanished into thin air at 2 in the morning. I slowly closed the banking application and looked up at the expensive walls of Derek's home office. My grief over my brother's passing was still a heavy anchor, but a sharper emotion was rapidly taking over. Pure resolve. I was not going to be a silent victim. I was a structural engineer. When a building shows signs of a catastrophic failure, you do not sit down and cry. You bring in heavy machinery and you tear out the rot. I reached for my phone, scrolling past my daughter's name to stop at Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not just a lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate litigator, a legal shark who destroyed corrupt executives in federal courtrooms. More importantly, he owed me a massive favor. Back in the 90s, Jonathan's father owned a commercial high-rise sinking due to a compromised foundation. Other firms told him to demolish it. I spent 3 months in the mud designing a custom steel underpinning system that saved his father from total bankruptcy. Jonathan swore that if I ever needed anything, I only had to call. I pressed call. The digital clock read exactly 2 in the morning. The phone rang 3 times before the line clicked open. I heard a groggy voice demanding to know who was calling at such an ungodly hour. I did not apologize. I simply said his name and told him it was Harrison Cole. The irritation vanished instantly. I heard the rustling of blankets and the click of a bedside lamp. He asked what was wrong. I took a deep breath and laid out the entire nightmare. I told him about the skipped funeral, the fake merger, the trip to Aspen, the fraudulent appraisal, and the forged home equity line of credit. Finally, I gave him the name of the entity holding my savings. Jonathan did not offer empty sympathy. He offered immediate action. I heard him walking down a hallway, a door opening, and the rapid clattering of a mechanical computer keyboard. He told me to stay on the line. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the frantic typing of a master litigator, hacking through layers of corporate obfuscation. Jonathan had access to premium financial databases and private federal court registries the general public never sees. He started pulling the digital threads of Apex Holdings LLC. His voice broke the silence, cold and analytical. He told me Apex was a ghost. It was an anonymous shell company registered in Delaware just 3 weeks ago. The registered agent was a post office box, and the officers were hidden behind a privacy shield. But Jonathan was a predator in these waters. He bypassed the state registry and dug into corresponding tax identification numbers and banking routing codes. He cross-referenced those numbers with commercial real estate licenses in Illinois. A heavy sigh echoed through the phone speaker. He had found the absolute link. The shell company was quietly registered by a subsidiary law firm that directly represented Derek. I asked Jonathan why Derek would go through such elaborate illegal lengths to steal the equity of my home. If his brokerage firm was simply struggling in a tough market, there were legal ways to declare bankruptcy. The furious typing on Jonathan's end intensified. He told me he was pulling the civil litigation records for Derek's primary company. Suddenly, Jonathan let out a low, sharp whistle. The truth was not just a failing business. It was a massive, sprawling criminal enterprise. Jonathan read the confidential legal files aloud to me in the dark. Derek was not just losing money. He was being actively sued by 3 different groups of powerful private investors for catastrophic embezzlement. For the past 4 years, Derek had been running a sophisticated financial shell game. He was taking millions of dollars from new investors to pay off the old ones while silently siphoning off massive percentages to fund his own lavish lifestyle. The custom Italian suits, the brand new luxury vehicles, the exclusive ski vacations in Colorado. None of it was actually earned. All of it was stolen money. And now the entire house of cards was collapsing right on top of him. The investors had filed an emergency injunction. If Derek did not produce a massive cash settlement to appease them by the end of the month, they were going to turn their expansive evidence over to the federal authorities. The $600,000 stolen from my house was not an investment. It was nothing but dirty blood money. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to pay off a legal settlement and keep Derek out of a federal penitentiary. My own daughter had willingly sacrificed my absolute financial security to save her criminal husband from wearing a prison uniform. I felt a sickening wave of betrayal wash over my entire body. I was ready to ask Jonathan how we could freeze the stolen funds, how we could immediately contact the National Bank Fraud Department, and shut this whole terrible nightmare down once and for all. But suddenly, the rapid, aggressive typing on the other end of the phone stopped completely. The silence on the line was profound and deeply unsettling. It lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. When Jonathan finally spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The confident, analytical tone of a corporate shark was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, horrific hesitation. He took a very slow, trembling breath. He said, "Harrison, I need you to brace yourself right now. They did not just steal the money to pay off Derek's debts. Look at your personal email inbox right this very second. I just sent you the official family court docket for next Monday." My hands were completely numb as I minimized the banking window and opened my personal email application. The bright screen felt like a piercing spotlight in the quiet, dark room. Sitting at the very top of my inbox was a secure, encrypted message from Jonathan Pierce. It contained a single, heavy digital attachment. A portable document format file titled "Emergency Petition for Full Conservatorship." I tapped on the file with a shaking finger and watched it slowly load onto the screen, feeling a suffocating pressure building deep within my chest. The first page displayed the official seal of the state family court system in bold, black ink. I read the formal legal heading printed at the top. Petitioner Natalie Cole. Respondent Harrison Cole. My own daughter, the child I had protected and provided for my entire life, was formally suing me for total legal control over my physical autonomy and my financial independence. I read through the opening paragraphs, my stomach churning violently, with every single calculated, emotionless legal word. She was officially petitioning a federal judge to declare me entirely mentally incompetent and incapable of managing my own basic human affairs. Suddenly, the past 6 months of my life flashed before my eyes, rapidly shifting from innocent memories into a terrifying, premeditated nightmare. Since the beginning of the year, Natalie had been unusually attentive and aggressively involved regarding my personal health. She insisted over and over again that my trusted physician of 20 years was completely outdated in his methods. She constantly pushed me to see a highly specialized, expensive private doctor she had supposedly found across town. She eagerly volunteered to drive me to every single one of these appointments. She sat right beside me in the sterile examination room, carefully answering the doctor's medical questions before I even had the chance to open my own mouth. She would place a comforting, fake hand on my shoulder and tell the man in the white coat that I was constantly forgetting simple things, that I was misplacing my house keys daily, that I was getting hopelessly lost walking in my own familiar neighborhood. At the time, I foolishly thought she was just being an overprotective daughter who was naturally anxious about her aging father. I would playfully roll my eyes and assure the stern doctor I was perfectly fine chalking up her exaggerated stories to normal family worry. But sitting here alone in Derek's office, the horrifying truth hit me with the brutal force of a speeding freight train. She was not protecting me from anything. She was methodically building a false paper trail to systematically destroy me. She was patiently laying the complex groundwork to permanently steal my absolute freedom. I scrolled further down the screen to review the supporting medical exhibits strategically attached to the legal petition. There were 3 official evaluation letters signed by that exact same shady private doctor. The clinical medical notes were an absolute malicious fabrication of my true mental reality. The doctor explicitly stated in bold letters that I was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia. He falsely claimed I was experiencing frequent, frightening paranoid delusions on a weekly basis. He even wrote with absolute supposed medical authority that I had recently begun exhibiting sudden, uncontrollable, violent outbursts that posed a severe physical danger to myself and my surrounding family members. I was reading a chilling description of a terrifying stranger, a violent madman who belonged securely locked inside a hospital ward, not the quiet, gentle structural engineer who spent his peaceful weekends carefully building wooden birdhouses with his beloved grandchildren. The legal petition clearly outlined her ultimate devastating demand. If the presiding judge approved this emergency motion on Monday morning, Natalie would instantly be granted absolute irrevocable control over every single aspect of my remaining life. She would have the unchecked legal power to liquidate my secure bank accounts, sell my historic craftsman house directly out from under me to pay off Derek's massive criminal debts, and forcefully lock me away in a restricted psychiatric care facility entirely against my will. I would permanently lose my home, my hard-earned life legacy, and my basic human dignity in the blink of an eye. I would become a helpless prisoner controlled entirely by my own blood. I read the damning document again, my engineer brain fighting desperately against the rapidly rising tide of my own emotional panic. I have spent my entire adult life meticulously analyzing architectural systems, constantly looking for the hidden weak points in massive structural designs. The federal legal system is just another structure. It heavily relies on solid foundational evidence to support its massive claims. I stared intensely at the falsified medical evaluations. They were incredibly damaging, yes, but they were still just typed words on a page from a single private doctor. The strict legal standard for an emergency immediate conservatorship that completely bypasses a standard jury trial requires something much more substantial. A judge would not simply strip a grown functional man of his constitutional rights based on exaggerated doctor visits and a greedy daughter's worried testimony. The court would absolutely demand undeniable concrete proof that I was an immediate physical danger to society. They needed a catalyst. They needed a recent, highly documented event to conclusively prove the violent instability that the corrupt doctor had claimed. The petition strongly referenced a highly volatile and dangerous psychological state, but it clearly lacked the final crushing piece of evidence to secure the judge's signature. I slowly lowered the digital tablet, staring blindly into the dark shadows of the room. Why would they leave on a luxury vacation just 2 days before filing such a massive legal strike? Why would they deliberately provoke me by callously forcing me to miss my hero brother's sacred funeral? My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. They needed me to break. They needed me to snap. To get an emergency conservatorship, they need immediate, undeniable proof of my violent instability. I pushed the digital tablet away, my mind racing through the horrific implications of their timeline. If they needed a highly documented event to prove my supposed violent instability to a federal judge by Monday morning, then this entire weekend was not just a convenient vacation for them. It was a meticulously designed psychological trap. I needed to know exactly how they planned to spring it. I turned my attention away from the heavy mahogany desk and looked toward the sleek silver laptop sitting quietly on a side table. Derek was notoriously arrogant about his own intelligence. He constantly mocked the security protocols at his office, often leaving his devices in sleep mode rather than fully shutting them down. I walked over and gently tapped the trackpad. The screen instantly glowed to life, bypassing the login screen completely, because the device was still tethered to his home network. I minimized his crowded email inbox and scanned the open applications running in the background. My eyes locked onto a small gray icon shaped like a microphone. It was a professional audio recording software typically used for archiving long conference meetings. The program was left open, displaying a timeline of recent files. The most recent file was created just 2 days ago. The title of the file was simply labeled as Legal Strategy Session. I plugged a pair of expensive noise-canceling headphones into the side of the laptop, placed them carefully over my ears, and pressed the play button. A sharp hiss of static filled my ears, followed by the familiar arrogant throat clearing of my son-in-law. Derek was speaking to a man with a deep, authoritative voice. I quickly deduced from their formal tone that this was the aggressive family court lawyer they had hired to orchestrate my legal demise. The lawyer sounded impatient. He explicitly warned Derek and Natalie that the forged medical documents and the private doctor's testimony would only get their foot in the courtroom door. He clearly stated that judges are inherently skeptical of sudden conservatorship requests, especially when a massive financial estate is instantly on the line. The lawyer told them that unless they could present irrefutable, undeniable evidence of an immediate danger, the judge would likely order a lengthy, independent medical evaluation, which would completely stall their timeline and expose the fraudulent bank loan. Then I heard my daughter's voice. It was the same sweet voice she used 30 years ago, but now it dripped with a chilling, calculated malice. She told the lawyer not to worry about the independent evaluation. She assured him that they were going to deliver the perfect piece of damning evidence by Sunday night. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning completely white, as I listened to my own child outline her master trap. Natalie explained her strategy with the cold precision of a military general planning an ambush. She said, "My uncle's funeral is this Sunday. My dad has been mourning his brother all week. He is physically exhausted, completely heartbroken, and highly emotional right now. We are going to pack our bags and tell him we have a sudden life or death business trip. We will dump the kids on him at the very last second and force him to miss the burial service entirely. He will be absolutely furious. He will be severely sleep-deprived, grieving, and totally overwhelmed by taking care of 2 highly energetic children all by himself. We are pushing him right to his absolute breaking point." The lawyer asked how missing a funeral would prove advanced dementia and violent tendencies. Derek's voice chimed in thick with cruel amusement. Derek explained that they knew exactly how to trigger my deepest frustrations. They knew I was a man of immense pride and rigid structure. By trapping me in my own home while I was mourning the most important person in my life, they were creating a pressure cooker of raw emotional agony. They were actively counting on my immense grief to manifest as an uncontrollable, explosive rage. Natalie confidently told the lawyer that I would eventually snap. She said he is going to lose his temper. He is going to scream at the kids. He might even throw something against the wall out of pure frustration. And when he does, we will have the perfect high-definition proof of his violent instability. The judge will have absolutely no choice but to grant the emergency conservatorship order immediately. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Proof. How could they possibly capture high-definition proof inside my house while thousands of miles away? The lawyer asked them the exact same question. Natalie let out a soft, dark laugh that made my stomach aggressively churn. She said Derek spent the entire week setting up the house. We have complete coverage. The hidden cameras will catch every single second of his breakdown. The audio recording continued to play, but I could no longer hear the treacherous words. A deafening ringing noise completely overwhelmed my ears. Hidden cameras. My own daughter and her criminal husband had secretly wired my house to record my lowest, most vulnerable moments. They turned my safe sanctuary into a digital prison designed to destroy my life. I slowly took the heavy headphones off my ears and let them fall onto the desk. The quiet home office suddenly felt incredibly small and deeply sinister. Every shadow seemed to hold a dark secret. Every corner felt like a physical threat. I stood perfectly still, controlling my rapid breathing with the strict discipline of a seasoned engineer. I slowly raised my head, scanning the expensive artwork lining the walls. My gaze drifted toward the ceiling, tracing the path of the electrical wiring. I stopped. Positioned directly above Derek's heavy mahogany desk was a standard circular smoke detector. I stared intensely at the small plastic grate. Deep inside the dark plastic air vents, a tiny unblinking red light stared directly back at me. My first instinct was violent. I wanted to grab the heavy brass lamp sitting on the corner of the mahogany desk and smash that plastic smoke detector into 1,000 jagged pieces. I wanted to scream into the hidden microphone and let them know that I had discovered their disgusting, treacherous trap. But I did not move a single muscle. The structural engineer inside my mind immediately took over, suppressing the raw, burning anger of a betrayed father. When you discover a massive structural flaw in a building, you do not just hit a load-bearing wall with a sledgehammer. If you strike blindly, the entire roof will collapse right on top of you, burying you in the rubble of your own impulsive rage. You have to step back, analyze the complex framework, locate the central pillar holding the toxic structure together, and remove it with absolute silent precision. I slowly lowered my gaze from the ceiling, acting as if I had merely been stretching my tired neck. I calmly turned off the silver laptop, wiped my fingerprints from the smooth trackpad, and quietly stepped out of the dark home office, softly closing the heavy oak door behind me. I went back to the guest bedroom and laid down in the dark, staring at the ceiling until the sun began to rise. I was not going to give them the explosive, violent reaction they so desperately needed. I was going to give them the exact opposite. When Sunday morning arrived, the exact day of my beloved brother's funeral, I did not shed a single visible tear. I pushed my profound grief down deep into the absolute bottom of my soul, locking it away behind a heavy door of pure resolve. I walked into the kitchen with a bright, cheerful smile plastered across my face. I opened the large stainless steel refrigerator and pulled out eggs, milk, and fresh blueberries. I started mixing pancake batter from scratch, humming a happy, upbeat tune just loud enough for the hidden microphones to pick up clearly. When little Leo and Mia woke up and wandered into the kitchen, rubbing their sleepy eyes, I greeted them with genuine, joyful laughter. I lifted Mia into the air and spun her around, listening to her sweet giggles fill the room. I let Leo help me flip the golden pancakes on the hot griddle, patiently guiding his small hands. Throughout the entire morning breakfast, I remained the absolute picture of a loving, patient, and perfectly stable grandfather. I told them funny stories about my childhood, asked them engaging questions about their favorite school subjects, and made sure my voice was consistently calm, measured, and entirely devoid of any frustration. But while I was smiling and serving warm maple syrup, my sharp analytical eyes were actively scanning every single inch of the open concept living space. I was systematically mapping the digital perimeter. I spotted a second hidden camera cleverly tucked inside the hollowed-out spine of a decorative book on the living room shelf. I found a third one perfectly concealed behind the dark-tinted glass of the digital smart clock resting on the kitchen counter. Using my decades of experience in spatial geometry and architectural drafting, I mentally calculated the exact viewing angles and focal lengths of each tiny lens. I identified the overlapping fields of vision, and more importantly, I pinpointed the very specific narrow blind spots where their digital eyes could not reach. I knew exactly where I could stand in the hallway to be completely invisible. I knew precisely which angle in the dining room would obscure my hand movements from the kitchen camera. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a digital cage. I was the architect navigating his own meticulously designed floor plan. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the children had finished their large breakfast and were happily settled on the plush living room sofa. I turned on the massive flat-screen television and found their absolute favorite animated movie. I made sure they had plenty of soft blankets and a large bowl of fresh fruit snacks. I stood in the exact center of the living room, looking directly toward the hidden camera concealed in the bookshelf. I smiled warmly and announced in a clear, highly pleasant voice that I was going to do a load of their laundry so their parents would not have to worry about chores when they returned from their stressful trip. I picked up a plastic laundry basket and casually walked out of the camera's sweeping view. The moment I crossed the invisible threshold into the designated blind spot, my cheerful smile vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, hardened determination. I did not go to the laundry room. I had a much more important technical task to complete. I knew that professional-grade high-definition surveillance cameras, recording continuous video and audio, required a massive amount of digital storage. They could not simply rely on a basic wireless connection uploading to an external cloud, especially not with the heavy firewalls Derek proudly maintained for his commercial business files. They had to be hardwired to a central physical hub located somewhere completely out of sight inside the house. I quietly opened the basement door and crept down the wooden stairs, my rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no sound on the steps. The basement was a massive, unfinished concrete space primarily used for storing old holiday decorations and heavy exercise equipment. I walked past the dusty cardboard boxes following a thick bundle of insulated black cables running securely along the wooden ceiling joists. The thick wires eventually fed directly into a locked, heavily ventilated metal utility closet tucked away in the farthest, darkest corner of the cold basement. I pulled my metal tension wrench from my pocket and swiftly popped the cheap lock on the utility door. Inside the space, a server box sat on a shelf. I plugged my encrypted hard drive into the server. I stared at the blinking green light on the heavy metal server box, watching the digital progress bar slowly fill across the small monitoring screen. My encrypted hard drive hummed quietly in the damp, cold basement air as it systematically copied every single byte of their treacherous surveillance footage. I opened the file directory and clicked on the most recent video clip. The screen illuminated with a high-definition, wide-angle view of the living room above me. I watched myself walk across the floor, smiling, and carrying the plastic laundry basket, completely unaware in their eyes, yet perfectly in control in mine. I possessed the absolute proof of their premeditated trap. They had meticulously recorded my every move intending to capture a manufactured breakdown, but instead, they had perfectly documented my complete sanity and their own malicious intent. Once the transfer was fully complete, I safely ejected my hard drive and slipped it deep into the front pocket of my faded jeans. I carefully closed the metal utility closet door, making sure to leave it looking entirely undisturbed. I walked back upstairs to the kitchen, checking on the grandchildren, who were still completely engrossed in their animated movie on the television. I stepped out onto the secluded back patio, pulling the sliding glass door tightly shut behind me to block out any noise. The crisp afternoon air filled my lungs. I pulled out my mobile phone and dialed Jonathan Pierce for the second time this weekend. He answered on the very first ring, his voice sharp and fully alert despite it being a Sunday afternoon. I quickly updated him on the hidden cameras I had discovered and the audio recording of their master plan that I had successfully extracted from Derek's laptop. I told him they were deliberately trying to manufacture a violent incident to secure the emergency conservatorship by Monday morning. Jonathan remained silent for a brief moment, digesting the sheer cruelty of my daughter's strategy. He let out a heavy sigh and told me that we needed to file an immediate counter-injunction to block the conservatorship request, but he worried about the massive $600,000 loan they had already secured against my house. He said that unraveling a legally binding financial contract of that immense magnitude could take years of grueling, expensive litigation in the civil courts. I stood on the wooden deck, looking out at the beautifully manicured backyard, and allowed a small, cold smile to form on my lips. I told Jonathan that we were not going to waste our time fighting in civil court. I told him it was finally time to execute Plan B. He sounded genuinely confused, asking me what I meant by that. I reminded him of a quiet Tuesday afternoon exactly 2 years ago when I had unexpectedly visited his downtown law office. 2 years ago, during the week of Thanksgiving, I had returned home early from a routine grocery run. I walked into my bedroom and found Natalie kneeling on the floor inside my walk-in closet. She was holding a set of metal lockpicks, desperately trying to force open the heavy steel lockbox where I kept my most sensitive personal documents and family heirlooms. When I confronted her, she immediately burst into dramatic tears, claiming she was just looking for an old recipe card that belonged to her late mother and had gotten confused about where it was stored. I accepted her flimsy excuse in the moment to avoid ruining the family holiday, but my deeply ingrained intuition was screaming at me. A daughter does not secretly pick a heavy steel lock to find a recipe card. That very same afternoon, while she was busy baking pies in the kitchen, I drove straight to Jonathan's office. I sat in his leather chair and instructed him to immediately and permanently revoke the comprehensive power of attorney I had foolishly signed for her in the hospital 3 years prior. We drafted a brand new ironclad legal document that completely excluded Natalie from any and all access to my medical or financial decisions. We officially filed the revocation with the state registry, legally rendering the original document absolutely null and void. I simply never told her I did it. I let her continue to believe she held the ultimate key to my life, waiting to see if she would ever be greedy enough to actually try and use it against me. I stood alone on the quiet outdoor patio, looking out at the yard and listening to the gentle morning breeze rustling through the leaves of the tall oak trees. I explained to Jonathan that the original power of attorney document Natalie had proudly presented to the National Bank last week was legally dead. It was nothing more than a worthless piece of paper that had been officially revoked and completely invalidated 24 months ago. I heard a sudden sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Jonathan's brilliant legal mind rapidly processed the monumental implications of what I had just revealed to him. The silence on the phone stretched for a few tense seconds before a low, dark chuckle rumbled through the speaker. He said, "Harrison, if the power of attorney was legally dead 2 years ago, then she had absolutely zero legal authority to sign your name on those bank documents." He paused, the heavy weight of the incoming justice settling firmly into his voice. He said, "Harrison, the $600,000 loan she took out last week is not just a standard case of elder abuse or simple civil theft. By intentionally presenting a revoked legal document to a federally insured financial institution to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars, she crossed a massive legal line. It is federal bank fraud. And the penalty for defrauding a national bank out of more than $500,000 is a severe mandatory federal prison sentence that she can never escape." The reality of Jonathan's words hung heavily in the crisp afternoon air. Federal bank fraud. A mandatory federal prison sentence. I stood on the wooden deck, the phone pressed firmly against my ear, processing the absolute destruction about to rain down upon my family. I had spent my career building structures designed to withstand catastrophic failure, but there is no blueprint for surviving the collapse of your own flesh and blood. I thanked Jonathan for his brilliant legal mind and told him to prepare the necessary paperwork for the authorities. I ended the call. My mind immediately turned to the two innocent souls sitting in the living room, Leo and Mia. If Natalie and Derek were facing severe federal indictments, the children would become immediate collateral damage. They would be thrust into a chaotic state foster system and traumatized forever. I needed a secure foundation for them, someone entirely insulated from the toxic criminal decay of their parents. I thought of Derek's parents, Richard and Martha. They were fundamentally decent, hard-working people. Richard was a retired history teacher, and Martha had spent 30 years as a pediatric nurse. They lived a modest life, completely blinded by the flashy, superficial success their son constantly paraded in front of them. They truly believed Derek was a brilliant, honest businessman. I knew the truth would completely shatter their hearts, but I also knew they loved their grandchildren fiercely. I pulled my phone out and dialed Richard's number. When he answered, his voice was warm and completely unaware of the looming nightmare. I cut through the pleasantries immediately. I kept my voice incredibly low and told him that there was a severe life-altering emergency involving Leo and Mia. I instructed him to bring Martha and drive to the house right this very second. I specifically warned them to park their car a full block away, to walk quietly through the rear alleyway, and to enter only through the sliding glass door on the back patio. Richard did not ask any unnecessary questions. The pure urgency in my voice was enough. Less than 40 minutes later, I saw them hurrying across the backyard grass, their faces pale with profound worry. I quickly slid the glass door open and ushered them inside, keeping my finger pressed to my lips to demand absolute silence. I guided them carefully through the precise digital blind spots I had mapped out earlier, leading them directly into a secluded corner of the formal dining room, where the hidden cameras could not reach. The children were still deeply engrossed in their movie in the adjacent living room, completely oblivious to the silent gathering. Martha gripped my arm tightly, her eyes wide with fear, silently pleading with me to explain what was happening. I did not try to soften the devastating blow. I pulled the copied financial documents from my jacket pocket and spread them out across the smooth mahogany dining table. I walked them through every single terrifying detail. I showed them the forged appraisal report on my historic craftsman home. I presented the fraudulent home equity line of credit pointing directly to the expertly forged signature at the bottom of the page. Then I revealed the civil litigation files Jonathan had forwarded to me. I watched the blood completely drain from Richard's face as he read the formal legal accusations of massive corporate embezzlement against his only son. He read the staggering numbers, realizing that Derek's luxurious lifestyle was entirely funded by millions of dollars of stolen investor money. Martha covered her mouth with trembling hands, shaking her head in fierce denial. She desperately whispered that there had to be a massive misunderstanding, that her son would never commit such horrific crimes. I knew the financial betrayal was hard to accept, so I delivered the crushing piece of evidence. I pulled out my digital tablet, inserted my encrypted hard drive, and opened the audio file I had extracted from Derek's laptop. I handed Martha a pair of headphones. I watched her tearful eyes widen in absolute horror as she listened to the recorded call. She heard her own son laughing cruelly about my brother's funeral. She heard Natalie coldly outlining her master plan to weaponize my profound grief. And worst of all, she heard them explicitly discussing how they were going to use Leo and Mia as emotional bait, intentionally pushing a grieving grandfather to the brink of a violent mental breakdown just to secure a fraudulent conservatorship. When the audio recording finished, Martha collapsed into Richard's arms, weeping uncontrollably into his shoulder. The heavy, muffled sounds of her broken heart filled the quiet dining room corner. Richard held his wife tightly, his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. The deep, unconditional love he held for his son was instantly replaced by a fierce, protective anger for his innocent grandchildren. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with intense sorrow and absolute clarity. He asked me what we needed to do to protect the children from the monsters they had raised. I placed a gentle, steadying hand on Richard's shoulder. I told him to go into the children's bedrooms and quietly pack their suitcases with enough clothes and toys to last for several weeks. I told them to take Leo and Mia out through the back patio, load them into their car down the street, and drive straight to their house without looking back. Martha wiped her tear-stained cheeks, her voice trembling as she asked me what was going to happen when Derek and Natalie finally returned from their fake business trip. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, my voice dropping to a cold, unwavering whisper. I said to her, a massive, dangerous storm is hitting this house precisely at 6 o'clock tonight. And I absolutely do not want my sweet, innocent grandchildren sitting in that front living room, watching their own parents being dragged out the front door in heavy steel handcuffs. Richard and Martha nodded in grim understanding. They did not hesitate for another single second. They quietly slipped into the guest bedroom where I had temporarily stored the children's overnight bags and frantically gathered their belongings. Martha walked into the living room masking her profound devastation with a gentle grandmotherly smile and told Leo and Mia that they were going on a special surprise adventure to their house. The children cheered softly, completely unaware of the terrifying reality hovering just above their heads. I stood by the sliding glass door and watched them walk safely across the backyard grass, holding their grandparents' hands tightly. Once they disappeared down the alleyway, I locked the heavy glass door and pulled the thick curtains shut. The massive suburban house was finally completely empty. The silence that settled over the rooms was absolute and deeply suffocating. I walked slowly into the formal dining room, the heavy weight of the entire day pressing down on my tired shoulders. I walked over to the expensive crystal decanter sitting on Derek's polished wooden bar cart. I picked up 2 heavy glass tumblers. It was finally time to honor the man who had given me everything. I glanced up at the large grandfather clock standing in the long hallway. The polished brass hands rested perfectly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In a quiet, peaceful cemetery across town, my beloved brother Bill was officially being lowered into the cold, damp earth. I was not there to stand by his wooden casket. I was not there to place a final flower on his resting place. I was trapped inside a digital prison built by my own treacherous daughter. I unscrewed the heavy glass stopper of the crystal decanter and poured a generous measure of rich amber whiskey into both of the tumblers. I picked them up and walked slowly into the exact center of the living room, fully aware of the hidden camera watching my every move from the bookshelf. I did not care anymore. I set one glass down on the mahogany coffee table, placing it gently on a dark leather coaster. I held the other glass in my rough, calloused right hand. I looked at the empty space sitting directly across from me, visualizing my brother sitting there with his thick wooden cane resting against his knee. The deep, agonizing sorrow that I had suppressed all morning finally rose powerfully into my chest. I raised my glass to the empty room and began to speak aloud. My voice was low, steady, and filled with a long lifetime of profound gratitude and overwhelming heartbreak. I said, "I am so sorry I am not there with you today, Bill. I am so terribly sorry that I could not stand beside your open grave and tell the whole world what a truly honorable, brave man you were." I took a slow sip of the burning whiskey, letting the sharp heat ground my rapidly racing thoughts. I continued speaking to the silent shadows. I told him all about the terrible betrayal I had uncovered. I told him about the forged bank documents, the stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the malicious, calculated plan to lock me away in a restricted psychiatric ward. I promised him that his immense, painful sacrifice in 1985 was not in vain. I said, "You broke your own body to save my life, Bill. You gave me a miraculous second chance to build a family. I spent my entire life trying to construct a beautiful, solid foundation for my daughter. But the materials I used were deeply flawed. The structure I built is entirely rotten from the very inside out. As a structural engineer, I know that you cannot simply paint over a collapsing, failing foundation. You have to tear the whole thing down to the ground, no matter how much it breaks your aching heart, so you can save the innocent people standing nearby. I am tearing it all down today, brother. I am protecting the young grandchildren you never got to see grow up." I sat down heavily on the soft leather sofa, resting my tired elbows on my knees, and spent the next 3 hours drinking my warm whiskey in absolute, uninterrupted silence. I watched the bright golden afternoon sunlight slowly crawl across the smooth hardwood floor, casting long, dark shadows that stretched ominously across the empty living room. I mentally rehearsed every single intricate detail of the incoming confrontation. I fortified my weary mind, purposely turning my fragile, broken heart into cold, impenetrable steel. I could not afford to feel a single ounce of weakness or sympathy when the heavy trap finally snapped shut. I knew perfectly well that Natalie would immediately try to use her dramatic tears to emotionally manipulate my deep fatherly instincts. I knew that Derek would aggressively try to intimidate me with his arrogant, blistering rage. I had to remain an absolute immovable object in the face of their incoming storm. The painful, agonizing hours drifted by the quiet tension in the house building to an almost unbearable, suffocating level. I slowly stood up from the leather sofa, my aging joints aching with a profound, heavy exhaustion. I carefully carried the 2 empty crystal whiskey glasses into the modern kitchen, washed them thoroughly in the stainless steel sink, and placed them neatly in the wooden drying rack. I walked back into the living room and sat back down in the dim, fading light. I waited patiently in the rapidly encroaching darkness. Suddenly, the deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock echoed heavily through the silent hallway. It was exactly 5:45 in the evening. A few tense, agonizing moments later, the heavy silence of the wealthy suburban neighborhood was abruptly broken. I heard the distinct, heavy crunch of expensive rubber tires rolling slowly onto the gravel driveway just outside the large front window. The luxury vacationers had finally returned. The heavy front door swung open, breaking the silence of the dark living room. I remained perfectly still on the leather sofa, shrouded in the shadows, camouflaged from their view. Natalie walked in first, letting out an exaggerated sigh that echoed through the foyer. She was dressed in a business suit, playing the exhausted corporate executive to perfection. Derek followed closely, pulling his tie loose and massaging his neck, as if he had spent days over a boardroom table. They were not carrying the snowboards or ski goggles I knew they had packed. Instead, they were tightly gripping sleek leather briefcases, completing their carefully constructed visual lie. I watched them go through their deceptive performance, feeling a cold detachment replace the last fragments of my fatherly warmth. They dropped their heavy keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, the sharp clinking sound slicing through the quiet air. Derek loudly complained about the turbulent flight from New York, intentionally projecting his voice so it would carry through the house. He said the merger negotiations had been completely brutal, but they had miraculously managed to save his firm at the very last second. It was a masterfully rehearsed script designed to make me feel foolish and guilty for ever doubting their vital importance. I sat silently in the dark, my hands resting calmly on my knees, letting them dig their hole a little bit deeper. Natalie kicked off her heels and walked into the living room, reaching blindly for the wall switch. As her hand brushed the plastic panel, she noticed my silent silhouette in the dim light. She let out a sudden sharp gasp, stumbling backward in perfectly feigned terror. She clutched her chest with manufactured panic. She flipped the switch, flooding the room with a harsh illumination that made my tired eyes briefly sting. I did not flinch. I did not move. I just sat there, looking directly up at my daughter. The brief flash of surprise on her face quickly melted into calculated concern. This was the exact moment they had been waiting for all weekend. This was the highly anticipated climax of their psychological trap. She took a deliberate step toward me, carefully positioning her body so her facial expressions would be perfectly captured by the hidden camera tucked inside the hollowed-out book on the shelf behind her. I could see the sinister anticipation dancing in her eyes. She was waiting for the explosion. She was waiting for the grieving old man to finally snap under the pressure of their cruel abandonment. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and narrowed her eyes, lowering her voice into a tone of condescending pity mixed with sharp accusation. She said, "Why in the world are you sitting here in the pitch dark, Dad?" She looked around the empty living room, her gaze sweeping over the perfectly clean kitchen and the silent hallway. She took another step closer, raising her voice just enough to ensure the hidden microphones would pick up every single word of her provocation. She said, "Are you losing your mind again? What is wrong with you? You are completely creeping me out. And where are my children? Where are Leo and Mia? Did you forget to feed them? Are they hiding in their rooms because you started yelling at them again?" She delivered the cruel accusations with absolute conviction, painting a terrifying picture of a dangerous, senile man who had completely lost touch with reality. Derek stepped up right behind her, crossing his arms and shaking his head in mock disgust. He looked down at me and said, "We trusted you to watch them for just one weekend, Harrison. We trusted you while we were out saving our family from financial ruin, and we come back to find you sitting in the dark like a complete lunatic. What exactly have you done with our kids?" They stood there together, an impenetrable wall of arrogant deceit, fully expecting me to rise from the sofa in a blind, furious rage. They expected me to scream about my brother's funeral. They expected me to throw my arms in the air, curse their names, and give them the exact high-definition evidence they needed to lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward by Monday morning. I looked deeply into my daughter's eyes, searching one final time for any lingering trace of a conscience, any small flicker of guilt for the horrific betrayal she was actively orchestrating against her own flesh and blood. There was absolutely nothing. Her eyes were as cold and empty as a frozen lake. The structural engineer inside my mind finalized the absolute necessity of the impending demolition. I did not raise my voice. I did not jump up from my seat. I did not give them a single ounce of the volatile anger they so desperately craved. Instead, I slowly leaned back into the soft leather cushions and crossed one leg comfortably over the other. I looked back and forth between the two of them, holding their intense, expectant gazes with a serene, unwavering calmness. I allowed a gentle, warm smile to slowly spread across my aged face. It was a smile of absolute, terrifying clarity. I spoke in a voice so soft and incredibly calm that the hidden microphones must have struggled to pick up the gentle frequency. I said, "You do not need to worry about the children. The kids are perfectly safe and far away from here. But you two look incredibly exhausted." I paused for a brief, heavy second, watching the arrogant confidence begin to fracture across their faces. I kept my warm smile perfectly in place and said, "You two look like you had a very rough flight back from Aspen." The heavy silence in the room instantly shattered. The color drained entirely from Derek's arrogant face. His fingers suddenly went completely limp, and his heavy leather briefcase slipped from his hand, crashing violently onto the hardwood floor. The heavy leather briefcase hit the polished hardwood floor with a deafening thud. The expensive metal clasps popped open, spilling a mess of glossy travel brochures and luxury ski resort receipts across the room. Derek stared at the scattered papers, his jaw completely slack, his eyes darting frantically between the evidence on the floor and my calm expression. The carefully constructed facade of the exhausted corporate executive instantly evaporated, replaced by the trembling fear of a man who realizes he has walked directly into a brick wall. Natalie stood entirely frozen beside him. Her hand was still resting on her hip, but her confident posture had completely crumbled. Her voice was a strained whisper when she asked me what I was talking about. She tried to force a dismissive laugh, attempting to rebuild the lie. She stammered that I was deeply confused, that they had just flown in from New York, and that my aging mind was clearly playing cruel tricks on me again. I did not move from the leather sofa. I gestured toward the scattered Aspen receipts on the floor with a deliberate wave of my hand. I told her she should remind her husband to empty his pockets before he tries to execute a masterclass in psychological manipulation. I told her I knew exactly where they had been. I knew about the private charter flight. I knew about the snowboards in the trunk. And most importantly, I knew about the hidden cameras recording every single second of our conversation. Before Natalie could formulate another lie, a deep voice echoed from the dark shadows of the adjoining kitchen. The voice smoothly announced that the state of Illinois requires two-party consent for audio recording in a private residence, making her little surveillance network a felony invasion of privacy. Natalie and Derek violently flinched, spinning to face the kitchen. From the darkness of the hallway, Jonathan Pierce slowly stepped into the bright living room light. He was wearing an impeccably tailored dark navy suit, looking every bit the ruthless corporate litigator that he truly was. He carried a thick, heavy leather briefcase in his right hand. His expression was completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. He walked with a slow, measured confidence, stopping right beside the mahogany coffee table. He placed his heavy briefcase onto the table with a solid, authoritative thud. Derek took a stumbling step backward, his eyes wide with genuine panic. He recognized Jonathan immediately. Any commercial real estate broker operating in Chicago knew exactly who Jonathan Pierce was, and they knew that if he was standing in your living room on a Sunday evening, your professional life was completely over. Jonathan did not even look at Derek. He kept his piercing gaze fixed squarely on my daughter. He formally introduced himself as my retained legal counsel and calmly informed her that he had spent the entire afternoon reviewing her profoundly flawed and highly illegal family court petition. The sheer shock of seeing a high-powered attorney in her home finally broke through Natalie's frozen panic, igniting a wild, desperate rage. She realized instantly that her meticulously planned trap had not just failed, but had been completely inverted. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She pointed a trembling finger at Jonathan and screamed at him to get out of her house immediately. She yelled that he was trespassing and that she was going to have him disbarred for harassing her family. But Jonathan did not even blink. He simply stood there, a towering monument of legal ruin, waiting for her to finish her childish tantrum. When yelling at my lawyer did not work, she turned her furious, wild eyes back to me. The mask of the concerned, loving daughter was entirely gone, replaced by a vicious, cornered animal. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding to know where her children were. She accused me of kidnapping them. She frantically reached into her designer purse, pulled out her mobile phone, and held it up like a weapon. She yelled that I was a completely deranged, violent old man who had finally lost his mind. She screamed that she was calling the police right this very second. She threatened to tell the emergency dispatchers that I had taken her children hostage, that I was a physical threat to society, and that this entire psychotic episode was the exact undeniable proof the family court judge needed to lock me away in a mental asylum for the rest of my miserable life. She wildly pressed the screen of her phone, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button, her chest heaving with aggressive theatrical panic as she continued to scream at me desperately, trying to create the violent scene she originally needed for her hidden cameras. I remained motionless on the leather sofa. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic screaming. I did not try to defend myself against her ridiculous, desperate accusations. I calmly reached into the front pocket of my faded jeans and pulled out my own mobile phone. I looked directly into my daughter's wild, furious eyes. I told her in a voice as cold and hard as structural steel that she did not need to bother calling the emergency dispatchers. I told her that she was absolutely right about one thing. The authorities definitely needed to see the undeniable proof of exactly what kind of monsters lived inside this beautiful suburban house. I looked at my glowing phone screen and pressed a single pre-programmed button. I sent a blank text message to a specific number Jonathan had given me earlier that afternoon. I looked back up at Natalie and gently placed my phone onto the coffee table. I told her the police were already here. Less than 5 seconds later, the heavy brass handle of the front door turned with a sharp mechanical click. The massive wooden door was pushed forcefully open, hitting the entryway wall with a loud bang. 2 federal agents dressed in dark windbreakers and a local uniformed police officer stepped firmly into the brightly lit foyer. The heavy footsteps of the federal agents echoed sharply against the hardwood floor of the foyer. Natalie instantly pointed a shaking finger in my direction, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria as she ordered the officers to arrest me for kidnapping her children. She expected them to rush forward and tackle the crazy old man sitting on the sofa. Instead, the agents completely ignored her theatrical performance. They did not even glance in my direction. They walked right past her, their expressions hard and strictly professional, and focused their intense gaze entirely on her husband. The local police officer calmly moved to stand directly in front of the heavy front door, effectively blocking the only exit out of the house. The sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The room was no longer a stage for my daughter's psychological manipulation. It had instantly transformed into a very real, very dangerous federal crime scene. Derek took a staggering step backward, his back hitting the cold drywall. He swallowed hard, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. His eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately searching for a way out of a trap that he had not even realized was set. Jonathan Pierce did not waste a single second. He unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and reached inside. He pulled out a thick stack of official banking documents and slapped them forcefully onto the mahogany coffee table right on top of their scattered luxury vacation receipts. The sharp smack of the heavy paper hitting the wood made Derek physically jump. I watched his eyes lock onto the top page. It was the fraudulent home equity line of credit agreement, the very same document that contained my perfectly forged signature authorizing the massive loan. But Jonathan was not finished. He reached into his briefcase a second time and pulled out a single heavily stamped piece of paper encased in a clear, protective folder. He placed it gently on the table right next to the fraudulent loan contract. This paper was the ultimate key locking them out. He smoothed the paper with his hand and looked directly at Derek. He announced that the single sheet of paper was a legally binding state-certified revocation of the medical and financial power of attorney. He made sure to emphasize the official date stamped clearly in red ink at the top of the page. November 22nd, exactly 2 full years ago. The color completely drained from Derek's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Jonathan clasped his hands in front of him and began to outline the absolute destruction of their lives in a calm, methodical voice. He explained the law with the cold precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. He told Derek that manipulating an elderly parent into giving up their financial autonomy is certainly a despicable act of moral bankruptcy, but in the eyes of the civil court, it can often be a long drawn-out battle. However, Jonathan continued intentionally presenting a legally dead, completely invalidated power of attorney document to a federally insured national bank is a vastly different story. He took a slow step closer to Derek, his imposing presence dominating the room. He stated that using that dead document to illegally extract $600,000 of pure home equity is not a family dispute. It constitutes a severe premeditated act of federal bank fraud. Jonathan pointed to the federal agents standing quietly in the room. He explained that because the targeted financial institution was federally insured, the crime carried immediate federal jurisdiction and a mandatory non-negotiable prison sentence of at least 10 full years behind iron bars. Jonathan did not stop there. He wanted Derek to know that every single dark corner of his criminal life had been fully illuminated. Jonathan casually mentioned the private corporate entity known as Apex Holdings. He watched Derek's knees visibly buckle at the sound of his own secret shell company. Jonathan calmly explained that the federal agents were already fully aware of the massive civil litigation currently pending against Derek's commercial real estate brokerage. He detailed how the stolen $600,000 had been illegally wired directly into that hidden account in a desperate last-minute attempt to pay off the angry private investors he had been actively embezzling from for the past 4 years. Jonathan's voice grew dangerously quiet as he delivered the final crushing blow. He told Derek that the authorities possessed the complete paper trail, the digital wire transfers, the fake appraisal report, and the audio recording from the hidden cameras, proving their malicious intent to silence me. The airtight trap they had spent months building for me had been completely reversed, and Derek was now hopelessly caught firmly inside its steel jaws. The profound weight of the incoming federal indictment crushed Derek instantly. He looked at the federal agents, his breathing rapid and shallow, completely overwhelmed by the terrifying reality of spending the next decade of his life locked inside a federal penitentiary. The arrogant, wealthy corporate broker vanished completely, replaced by a pathetic, desperate coward who would do absolutely anything to save his own skin. He was willing to sacrifice the mother of his children. He physically recoiled, stepping aggressively away from his wife, as if she were suddenly infected with a deadly disease. He raised his trembling hands defensively in the air and shook his head violently. He pointed his index finger directly at Natalie's face, his voice cracking with selfish panic. He screamed that he had absolutely nothing to do with the forged signature on the bank documents. He yelled that it was all her idea from the very beginning, that she was the one who physically signed the fraudulent papers and that it was her father's house. He looked desperately at the federal agents and begged them to believe that she had manipulated him into the entire scheme. Natalie stood perfectly still, her eyes wide with absolute shock, letting out a loud, agonizing scream of pure betrayal that echoed off the living room walls. Her piercing scream slowly faded into a pathetic, breathless sob. Natalie stared at her husband, her face twisted in a mask of absolute horror, as she realized that the man she had conspired with was willing to sacrifice her without a single moment of hesitation. But the survival instinct of a cornered predator is a truly remarkable thing. Instead of collapsing into a puddle of defeated tears, she violently spun around and marched directly toward the two federal agents. She positioned herself firmly between the officers and her trembling husband, forcefully pointing her manicured finger back toward me. Her voice took on a frantic, pleading tone. She told the agents that they had to listen to her. She insisted that they were making a catastrophic mistake. She claimed that the entire situation was nothing more than a tragic misunderstanding brought on by a severely sick, delusional old man. She begged the officers to look at the family court petition she had filed, desperately trying to spin her malicious conservatorship plot into a protective medical shield. She told them that my mind was completely gone, that I was suffering from advanced dementia, and that my ruthless lawyer was taking cruel advantage of my rapidly declining mental state. She swore up and down that I was completely paranoid, that I had entirely made up the unbelievable story about a fake business trip, and that I had probably forged those complicated banking documents myself in a sudden fit of severe, uncontrollable psychosis. I watched my own daughter attempt to weaponize my sanity right in front of federal law enforcement. I did not feel a single drop of anger. I only felt a profound, exhausting pity for the hollow shell of a human being she had become. I slowly stood up from the comfortable leather sofa. My movements were calm, deliberate, and entirely steady. The federal agents immediately turned their undivided attention to me, their hands resting cautiously near their heavy utility belts, waiting to see how the supposedly violent, highly unstable old man would react to such aggressive public accusations. I did not shout. I did not wave my arms in protest. I simply reached into the front pocket of my faded jeans and pulled out my mobile phone. I calmly explained to the agents that my daughter and her husband had spent the entire week secretly installing hidden surveillance cameras throughout my private home. I told them that they did this to capture a manufactured psychological breakdown because they desperately needed high-definition video proof to secure an emergency conservatorship order by Monday morning. I tapped the glowing screen of my phone, opened the digital audio file I had extracted from Derek's computer, and turned the volume speaker all the way up. I handed the digital device directly to the lead federal agent. The crisp, perfectly clear audio of Derek and Natalie discussing their treacherous Aspen vacation and their calculated plot to destroy my entire life filled the tense, quiet living room. The seasoned agents listened in absolute silence as my daughter's recorded voice cruelly laughed about my deceased brother's funeral. They heard her proudly outline her master plan to use her own innocent children as emotional bait to push a grieving grandfather to the absolute brink of temporary insanity. As the damning recording played, the last remaining drops of healthy color completely vanished from Natalie's face. Her frantic, desperate energy evaporated into the thin air, leaving her completely paralyzed by the undeniable, horrific echo of her own malicious words. The lead agent slowly lowered my phone, his stern expression hardening into a look of absolute professional disgust. He looked right at Natalie and told her that he had heard more than enough to establish criminal intent. Natalie slowly turned her gaze toward me, her eyes suddenly brimming with genuine, terrified tears. She took a small, hesitant step forward and softly whispered my name. She called me Dad, her voice breaking with the fragile innocence of a little girl desperately seeking forgiveness from her protector. But she was no longer my little girl. I looked her directly in the eye, my posture perfectly straight, and my voice devoid of any lingering fatherly warmth. I told her that when she was a young child, I spent countless hours teaching her the fundamental, unbreakable rules of structural engineering. I reminded her of the absolute most important lesson I ever gave her. I said, if a residential foundation is cracked, you do not simply paint over the ugly concrete to make it look pretty. You do not ignore the deep structural rot and blindly hope the house miraculously stays standing. You demolish it. You tear it all the way down to the underlying dirt, and you start over. I told her that she was the deep structural rot threatening to collapse our entire family, and I was finally tearing it down. The federal agents stepped right past her, moving swiftly toward Derek. They commanded him to turn around and place his hands firmly behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the silent suburban house like a final, definitive gavel strike. As the local police officer began reading Derek his constitutional rights, reciting the familiar legal phrases about the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, Jonathan Pierce stepped forward from the dark shadows of the hallway. He walked directly up to Natalie, who was trembling uncontrollably as she watched her husband being physically restrained. Jonathan reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored navy suit and pulled out a thick, sealed white envelope. He held it out to her, his expression completely unreadable and entirely professional. He calmly informed her that the envelope contained a formal notification from Child Protective Services acting in coordination with an emergency family court custody order. He told her that her children were legally removed from her custody and placed safely with Richard and Martha. Natalie took the thick white envelope from Jonathan with violently shaking hands. She tore at the paper seal, her eyes frantically scanning the official letterhead of the State Child Protective Services. I watched as her breathing became dangerously rapid, her chest heaving as she absorbed the clinical, devastating words printed on the page. Jonathan stood over her, his voice a relentless drumbeat of consequence. He informed her that Richard and Martha had officially been granted emergency temporary custody of Leo and Mia by a federal judge, citing the toxic and criminally hazardous environment she had deliberately created in her own home. He added almost as an afterthought that the National Bank Fraud Department had effectively frozen every single financial asset bearing her name or her husband's name. The joint checking accounts, the offshore trust funds, the college savings plans, absolutely everything was locked down under a sweeping federal mandate, pending a thorough criminal investigation. She was entirely penniless, instantly stripped of the lavish lifestyle she had sacrificed her own father to maintain. At that exact moment, the lead federal agent grasped Derek firmly by the bicep and marched him roughly toward the open front door. Derek did not even look back at his wife. He just kept his head hung low, shuffling out into the cool evening air toward the waiting patrol cars, his expensive custom suit looking pathetic against the cold steel of the handcuffs. The local police officer followed closely behind, shutting the heavy wooden door with a loud final click that echoed through the foyer. The sound of the door closing seemed to break whatever fragile strings were still holding Natalie upright. She looked around the expansive, beautifully decorated living room, suddenly realizing the absolute magnitude of her profound isolation. Her criminal husband was gone, headed straight for a federal holding cell. Her precious children were miles away, safely protected from her toxic influence. Her bank accounts were completely frozen, leaving her without a single dollar to her name. She had absolutely nothing left. The arrogant, wealthy, manipulative woman who had stood before me just 10 minutes ago completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She collapsed. Her knees hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy thud, her designer business suit crumpling around her. She looked up at me from the ground, her face soaked in genuine terrified tears. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, reaching out with desperate, trembling fingers to grab the hem of my faded jeans. She buried her face into her hands and began to beg. Her voice was a broken, agonizing wail that tore through the quiet house. She pleaded for my forgiveness, her words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent stream of desperate apologies. She cried that she was so incredibly sorry that she had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But even in her absolute lowest moment, She could not take full responsibility for her own malicious actions. She frantically began to shift the blame, pointing her trembling finger toward the closed front door where Derek had just vanished. She swore to me that it was all Derek's idea. She claimed that he had ruthlessly pressured her, that he had manipulated her into participating in the cruel conservatorship plot because he was utterly terrified of going to federal prison. She sobbed that she was just a helpless, frightened wife trying to protect her family from his catastrophic financial mistakes, begging me to remember the sweet little girl I had raised. As I looked down at my weeping daughter, clutching my legs and begging for mercy, a deep, agonizing pang of fatherly sorrow physically squeezed my fragile heart. For a fleeting fraction of a second, I did not see the treacherous woman who had tried to lock me away in a psychiatric ward. I saw the little girl in the blue overalls who used to follow me around my dirty garage, handing me my heavy metal tools while I fixed the family car. I saw the teenager I had proudly walked down the aisle, the daughter I had fiercely protected with every ounce of my strength for over 40 years. My rough, calloused hand instinctively twitched, wanting nothing more than to reach down, stroke her hair, and tell her that everything was going to be all right, just like I had done 1,000 times before. But then the dark shadows of the empty living room shifted, and the cold reality of the day came rushing back with unforgiving clarity. I remembered sitting completely alone in this silent house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I remembered the heavy, crushing weight of missing my brother's funeral. I pictured Bill's wooden casket being lowered into the cold ground, without me there to say a proper, honorable goodbye. I remembered the tiny, unblinking red light of the hidden surveillance camera staring down at me from the plastic smoke detector, patiently waiting for me to lose my mind so she could steal my absolute freedom. The brief warm spark of fatherly sympathy was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of structural steel. I slowly took a deliberate step backward, forcing her desperate, trembling hands to slip off the fabric of my jeans. I looked down at her tear-stained face one final time, my expression completely devoid of any lingering emotion. I told her that Derek may have provided the hidden cameras and the forged bank documents, but she was the one who had happily handed him the heavy hammer to smash my life to pieces. I told her that a true victim of manipulation does not eagerly use their own innocent children as emotional bait to destroy their grieving father. I told her that she had made her ultimate choice the moment she decided my freedom and my dignity were worth less than her luxury ski vacations and her imported leather sofas. I turned my back to her and slowly walked toward the front hallway. Jonathan Pierce silently followed closely behind me, his heavy leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand. I reached out and grasped the cool brass handle of the heavy wooden front door. Behind me, Natalie let out a raw, deafening scream of pure, unadulterated terror. She screamed my name over and over again, begging me not to leave her alone in the dark, pleading for a second chance that she absolutely did not deserve. I pushed the door open, stepping out into the crisp, clean evening air. I walked down the long, winding concrete driveway, without looking back a single time, leaving my daughter sobbing hysterically on the floor of the empty camera-rigged house she had built to be my permanent prison. The crisp evening air filled my lungs as I walked away from that sprawling suburban house. I reached the end of the long block where my reliable truck was parked under the dim glow of a street lamp. I climbed inside, gripped the worn leather steering wheel, and let out a long, shuddering breath. The deafening sound of my daughter crying had faded into the quiet hum of the engine, but the absolute finality of what I had just done settled deep into my bones. I drove back to my peaceful craftsman home, walked through the front door, and locked it securely behind me. The terrible storm had finally passed, leaving nothing but a profound, ringing silence in its wake. Fast forward exactly 1 month. The wheels of federal justice usually turn at a painfully slow pace, but when you hand prosecutors a perfectly wrapped gift containing high-definition audio confessions, forged bank documents, and a clear trail of stolen money, those wheels spin with terrifying speed. Jonathan Pierce called me almost every single day with detailed updates regarding the massive legal fallout. The criminal case against my son-in-law was incredibly brief. Derek sat in a cold federal holding cell for 3 days before his arrogant bravado completely shattered. Facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the terrifying prospect of a lengthy trial that would expose his corporate embezzlement, his expensive defense attorney advised him to surrender. Derek accepted a strict plea deal to avoid the maximum penalty. He pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts, including federal bank fraud and corporate embezzlement. The judge showed him no mercy. Derek was formally sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his real estate licenses, and ordered to pay millions in mandatory restitution to his defrauded investors. He traded his custom Italian suits for a standard-issue prison uniform, locked away in a world where his superficial charm meant absolutely nothing. As for Natalie, the consequences of her profound betrayal dismantled every single aspect of her carefully constructed reality. Because she had willingly participated in the fraudulent home equity loan, the federal authorities and the national bank came down on her with absolute ruthlessness. To avoid joining her husband in a federal prison cell, she was forced to completely cooperate with the fraud investigators. The bank demanded immediate repayment of the stolen $600,000. Without Derek's illegal income to support her lavish lifestyle, she had no choice but to immediately liquidate her assets. She was forcefully compelled to sell her beautiful, sprawling suburban house at a massive financial loss, just to satisfy the aggressive bank liens and the mounting legal fees. The luxury cars, the expensive jewelry, the imported leather furniture, everything was repossessed or sold off at public auctions. My daughter now lives in a cramped, poorly lit one-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. She works long, exhausting hours as a low-level administrative assistant just to afford her basic monthly rent. But the loss of her superficial wealth was nothing compared to the devastating loss of her family. The family court judge reviewed the harrowing report provided by Child Protective Services alongside the horrific audio recording of her planning to intentionally traumatize me while I was mourning my brother. The court ruled that Natalie was a severe emotional danger to her children. Richard and Martha were officially granted full physical custody of little Leo and Mia. Natalie was stripped of her parental rights and reduced to a heavily restricted schedule. She is currently only allowed 2 hours of supervised visitation every other weekend. She has to sit in a sterile, brightly lit room at a state facility constantly watched by a court-appointed social worker desperately trying to explain to her young, confused children why they can no longer live with their mother. She built a digital trap to steal my freedom, and in the end she built a permanent prison of isolation for herself. While Natalie's world collapsed into absolute ruin, Jonathan Pierce worked tirelessly to completely repair the severe damage done to my own foundation. Armed with the legally certified revocation of the power of attorney, Jonathan systematically dismantled the fraudulent bank loan. The National Bank officially acknowledged the severe breach of protocol committed by their loan officers and the corrupt notary public. The massive $600,000 debt was entirely erased from my financial records forever. The heavy lien was officially removed, and the title to my historic craftsman house was completely cleared, restoring my property back to the safe, unburdened sanctuary it was always meant to be. The malicious family court petition was the next fragile pillar to easily fall. Jonathan filed an immediate motion to dismiss presenting the audio evidence of their calculated extortion plot. The presiding judge was absolutely furious upon hearing the truth. The judge threw the entire conservatorship case out of court with extreme prejudice, ensuring that Natalie could never again attempt to file such a baseless, vindictive claim against me in the state of Illinois. But Jonathan and I did not stop there. We turned our sharp focus toward the shady private doctor who had so willingly fabricated my medical evaluations. A physician who sells false diagnoses to help greedy relatives steal from the elderly is a dangerous threat. Jonathan submitted the doctor's fraudulent paperwork, along with my pristine medical records from my actual physician, directly to the state medical board. A swift, aggressive investigation was immediately launched. When the investigators raided his private clinic, they discovered a long, horrific history of similar fraudulent practices. The doctor permanently lost his medical license in absolute disgrace. He now faces severe criminal charges for medical fraud and conspiracy. The toxic rot threatening to destroy my life was meticulously identified, removed, and utterly destroyed. I was finally standing on solid ground, again breathing free air in the quiet comfort of my own home, completely ready to rebuild my future. The crisp autumn air carried the cheerful sound of children laughing across the freshly mowed grass of my backyard. I stood on the wooden deck of my craftsman house holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. I walked down the short flight of stairs and handed one of the mugs to Richard, who was sitting comfortably next to his wife Martha on the sturdy cedar bench I had built many years ago. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that makes you appreciate the simple, quiet rhythm of a peaceful life. We sat together in a comfortable, companionable silence, watching little Leo and Mia chase a bright yellow soccer ball across the wide expanse of the yard. The children were completely vibrant and full of pure, unrestrained joy, entirely shielded from the devastating adult storm that had so violently upended their young lives just a few short months prior. Looking at Richard and Martha sitting in my garden, I realized that a profound shift had occurred in my understanding of what a family truly is. We were 3 aging parents who had all suffered the ultimate heartbreak of watching our own flesh and blood succumb to the absolute worst kinds of greed and moral decay. But instead of letting that shared tragedy break us apart or sink us into a bitter, lonely despair, it had forged a deep, unbreakable bond between us. We had become a new, highly unconventional family, carefully built from the broken pieces left behind by our toxic children. Our foundation was no longer based on blind inherited loyalty, but on absolute, unwavering honesty and a fierce mutual dedication to protecting the innocent lives playing right in front of us. Martha took a slow sip of her warm coffee and smiled brightly as little Mia successfully kicked the ball past her older brother, throwing her tiny arms up in a victorious cheer. Martha leaned over and gently patted my arm, her eyes shining with a deep, unspoken gratitude for the safe haven we had managed to create together. I smiled back, feeling a profound sense of genuine peace settle into the tired bones of my chest. But as a seasoned structural engineer, I know that peace is never something you can simply assume will last forever without proper support. Peace is a delicate structure that must be actively maintained, heavily reinforced, and legally protected against all future storms. That is exactly why, earlier that very same week, I had sat down in the polished downtown office of Jonathan Pierce for one final crucial meeting. We were not there to dismantle a fraudulent bank loan or file a defensive legal injunction. We were there to carefully construct a permanent, impenetrable financial fortress. I instructed Jonathan to take the entirety of my life, savings, my remaining retirement accounts, and the full legal deed to my beloved craftsman house and place every single asset directly into a highly restricted, legally binding, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a very specific, incredibly powerful legal instrument. Once the heavy documents are formally signed, notarized, and fully executed, the complex terms cannot be altered, amended, or canceled by anyone, not even by me. It effectively removes my personal direct ownership of the physical assets and transfers them entirely to the protective, independent control of the trust itself, managed strictly by a neutral court-appointed fiduciary. I established this massive financial shield for one single unwavering purpose. I wanted to guarantee, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that the legacy I had spent 40 grueling years building with my own 2 calloused hands would go directly to Leo and Mia when they reached early adulthood. Jonathan drafted the complex legal paperwork with the exact same meticulous, aggressive precision he used to completely destroy Derek in the federal courtroom. We inserted thick layers upon layers of ironclad stipulations and strict exclusionary clauses into the dense contract. I made absolutely certain that Natalie's full legal name was explicitly written into the exclusionary documents. The legal language we utilized was remarkably cold, scientifically precise, and legally devastating. It clearly dictated that my estranged daughter was never to receive a single penny of my accumulated wealth. She was never to be granted any form of administrative access to the protected accounts, and she was strictly prohibited from ever contesting the trust in a civil court of law. Even if she miraculously managed to manipulate a sympathetic judge or fabricate another elaborate, deceitful narrative in the distant future, the rigid legal structure of the irrevocable trust would act as a massive, solid concrete wall, completely blocking her out from any financial gain. I had permanently and purposefully severed her from the financial safety net she had so arrogantly tried to steal from me. She would have to survive the rest of her natural life relying entirely on her own exhausted efforts, forever locked outside the wealthy gates she had tried to force open with cruel deceit. As I sat on the wooden bench watching my grandchildren laugh in the warm autumn sun, I knew that my architectural work was finally finished. I had successfully demolished the rotten, failing pillars of my past, and in their place I had poured a fresh, flawless concrete foundation that would easily support the bright, innocent future of the two young children I loved more than life itself. This new family we built was not defined by bloodlines, but by truth, respect, and a shared promise to always protect each other from the dark storms. I looked down at the rough calluses on my hands. They were the scars of a very long, difficult life. But for the very first time in my entire existence, I finally felt like I had built something that could truly stand the test of time. I took a deep, steadying breath of the crisp autumn air, knowing that they were all finally safe and secure for the rest of their long, beautiful lives ahead. A few days after my meeting with Jonathan, I woke up early in the morning before the sun had fully risen above the horizon. The neighborhood was completely silent, blanketed in a thick, cool autumn fog that clung to the damp grass. I dressed in my warmest flannel shirt and a heavy denim jacket, feeling a deep, profound need to fulfill a promise I had made in an empty living room weeks ago. I walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a single glass bottle of dark stout beer. It was Bill's absolute favorite brand, the exact same kind we used to drink together on my back porch after a long, grueling week of pouring concrete and bending steel. I carefully placed the cold bottle on the passenger seat of my truck and drove slowly through the quiet city streets toward the local cemetery. The drive was peaceful, giving me ample time to reflect on the incredible turbulence of the past month. I drove through the tall iron gates of the cemetery just as the morning sun began to pierce through the heavy fog, casting long golden rays of light across the perfectly manicured green lawns and the neat rows of polished granite headstones. I parked my truck along the narrow gravel path, grabbed the cold bottle of beer, and walked slowly down the gentle hill toward the newer section of the cemetery. The morning dew soaked into the leather of my boots as I navigated the quiet grounds. I finally reached his resting place. The headstone was simple, elegant, and perfectly cut, exactly the way Bill would have wanted it. I stood there for a long time just reading his name carved deeply into the smooth gray stone, accompanied by the dates of his birth and his passing. The reality of his physical absence hit me with a fresh wave of sorrow, but it was no longer the desperate, agonizing grief that had paralyzed me on the day of his funeral. It was a quiet, respectful sadness, the kind that honors a beautiful life completely lived. I knelt down slowly on the damp grass, feeling the cold moisture seep through the knees of my faded jeans. I reached out and traced the carved letters of his name with my calloused fingers. I smiled softly, remembering the loud, booming sound of his laughter and the heavy, rhythmic thud of his wooden cane on my hardwood floors. I took the metal cap off the glass bottle of stout beer. I held the bottle out over the fresh soil and slowly tipped it forward. The dark, rich liquid poured out, soaking deeply into the dark earth. I watched the foam settle into the grass, feeling a powerful sense of connection to my brother. I took a deep breath letting the crisp morning air fill my tired lungs, and I finally began to speak. I told him everything. My voice was low and steady, carrying through the silent, misty air of the sprawling cemetery. I said, "I brought you your favorite drink, Bill. I am so incredibly sorry that I was not here on the day they laid you to rest. I know you would understand, but I still needed to come here and tell you face to face. I needed you to know that the little brother you saved all those years ago finally learned how to stand up and protect himself." I sat down on the wet grass, crossing my legs, completely ignoring the cold. I explained the horrific details of the trap Natalie and Derek had set for me. I told him about the hidden cameras, the forged bank loans, and the terrifying family court petition designed to lock me away in a dark psychiatric ward. I told him how my heart broke into a million pieces when I realized my own daughter had orchestrated my absolute ruin. But then I told him about the strength I found in his memory. I said, "When I was sitting alone in that dark house waiting for them to spring their trap, I thought about the sheer courage it took for you to run toward that falling steel beam in 1985. I continued speaking, the profound realization washing over me like a warm wave of absolute clarity. I said, "You did not hesitate, Bill. You saw a catastrophic disaster falling directly toward me, and you threw your own body into the wreckage to push me out of harm's way. You shattered your legs so that I could walk away completely unharmed. For decades, I thought your sacrifice was just about keeping me alive. I thought it was simply about letting me survive that terrible day on the construction site. But sitting in that empty living room, surrounded by hidden microphones and treacherous lies, I finally understood the true weight of what you did." I looked directly at the engraved letters on the cold granite stone, my eyes filling with warm tears of profound gratitude. I said, "You did not just save my life in 1985, brother. You gave me the absolute strength and the heavy responsibility to save the rest of my life right now. If I had let my daughter destroy me, if I had simply surrendered to her cruel manipulation and allowed her to lock me away, I would have been throwing away the miraculous second chance you suffered so terribly to give me. I realized that honoring your ultimate sacrifice meant absolutely refusing to let my life be ruined by toxic, greedy people." The tears silently tracked down my weathered cheeks, but they were tears of profound peace. I said, "You saved me twice, brother. Your beautiful memory saved my soul from being crushed." I placed my rough hand on the cold granite headstone. I whispered a final heartfelt thank you to the silent stone, turned around, and walked forward into the bright, warm sunlight, completely ready to truly live my saved life. As I walked out of those iron gates and back into the normal rhythm of the world, a heavy weight permanently lifted from my shoulders. A month has passed since that morning at the cemetery, and my life has settled into a beautiful, quiet routine. I spend my days working in my woodshop, teaching my grandson Leo how to properly measure and cut timber, and watching my granddaughter Mia paint the birdhouses we build together. Richard and Martha come over every Sunday for dinner. We do not talk about Derek sitting in a federal prison, and we do not talk about the cramped apartment where my daughter now lives alone. We talk about the future. We talk about the children. We laugh, and our laughter fills the spaces that were once suffocated by deceit. But I know that many of you listening to my story right now might be sitting in the exact same dark place I was just a few short weeks ago. You might be staring across a dining room table at a family member who uses your love as a weapon. There is a very dangerous lie that society forces upon us, especially upon parents. We are told from the moment we hold our children in our arms that family is absolutely everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that we must forgive our relatives no matter how terribly they treat us. We are conditioned to believe that setting a boundary with a family member is a selfish act. But let me tell you something I learned the hard way. Sometimes the blood that is supposed to bind you together is the exact same water that is slowly drowning you. Abuse should never be tolerated just because it comes from someone who shares your last name. Disrespect does not suddenly become acceptable just because the person tearing you down is the same person you once taught how to walk. I spent 40 years of my life believing that my ultimate duty as a father was to provide a relentless safety net for my daughter. I thought that if I just gave her enough, loved her enough, and forgave her enough, she would eventually learn to appreciate the foundation I built for her. I was entirely wrong. When you give everything to someone who has no moral compass, they do not become grateful. They simply become entitled. They begin to view your generosity as a weakness, and they start looking for ways to extract every last ounce of your worth before you are gone. My daughter did not just want my money. She wanted my absolute surrender. She wanted to erase my dignity, lock me away in a sterile hospital room, and steal the legacy I had broken my back to build. The hardest thing a parent can ever do is look at their own child and realize that they have raised a predator. It goes against every single biological instinct we possess. Your heart screams at you to protect them, to cover up their mistakes, to take the blame upon yourself. But you cannot protect someone from the consequences of their own malicious actions without eventually becoming their ultimate victim. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire career looking at blueprints. I know that every single building, no matter how tall or magnificent, relies entirely on the strength of its foundation. If the concrete is poured incorrectly, if the steel rebars are completely rusted through, the building will inevitably collapse. You cannot save a doomed structure by simply hanging new curtains or painting the walls a brighter color. You have to be brave enough to swing the wrecking ball. You have to be strong enough to tear it all down to the dirt, clear away the toxic debris, and start over from scratch. That is exactly what I did to my own family. I demolished the toxic structure my daughter built, and I poured a brand new foundation for my grandchildren. It was the most painful decision of my entire life, but it was also the most necessary. I am sharing my story with you today because I know there are good, hardworking people out there who are being secretly crushed by the immense weight of their own toxic families. You might be listening to this while hiding in your bedroom or driving in your car, wondering how much longer you can endure the manipulation and the constant disrespect. I am here to tell you that you absolutely have the right to walk away. You have the right to protect your peace, your finances, and your mental health, even if it means walking away from your own flesh and blood. You do not owe your life to anyone who actively tries to destroy it. Some people will say I went too far by letting my daughter lose everything. They will say a father should never turn his back on his own child, no matter what terrible crimes she committed. But respect is not inherited. It is earned. And abuse should never be tolerated just because it comes from blood. I removed the safety net she was using to strangle me, and I let her face the real world entirely on her own. Did I do the right thing? Or was I too harsh? Let me know in the comments. I always read every single comment, and I truly do value your honest opinions. And please tell me which city you are watching from today. It brings me so much joy to know how far these stories travel. If you found value in my journey, do not forget to subscribe and leave a super thanks if my story gave you the courage to stand up for yourself. Always protect your foundation. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story. Goodbye for now, my dear friends. And please remember to always stay incredibly strong out there in the wide open world today.